April is Alcohol Awareness Month, and sobriety is not recovery. This is Wrestling with Recovery. Hello and welcome to Wrestling with Recovery, your podcast partner in the fight against your old addiction lifestyle and your new life in recovery. Yeah, I'm still working on that one. I don't know if it'll stick, but we'll give it a try. My name is Zol. Glad to have you here today with me in today's episode. What is recovery and why is sobriety not recovery? We're going to dig into those topics and more. But first, I do want to start off by saying a big thank you to everyone who listened to episode 0, the prologue, kind of giving a little bit of a feel of what to expect moving forward. Tremendous response on all the socials. Also, people reaching out, way too many to name because I know I would leave someone out and I don't want to do that. So, thank you to all who had encouraging and constructive criticism things to say. I greatly appreciate it. Make sure to give us a follow on the socials if you haven't done so already. Head on over to Wrestling with Recovery Pod. That's on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads, also on TikTok as well. And WW Recovery Pod, Wrestling with Recovery Pod is way too long on Twitter, so we just went WW Recovery Pod. So, yeah, go give us a like and follow on there. Also, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and share on the YouTube channel. So, if you were listening to episode 0, you know that I have a background in broadcasting, specifically in radio. And back in the day, whenever I was doing a morning show, I had this bit that I like to call 5 Obscure Facts. It was a lot of fun to do and had a lot of positive feedback from people that loved the randomness of it, or because it was a good icebreaker at family functions, maybe in the family group chat. And as I was putting this show together, I realized this show needed something. It was missing something. And immediately the light bulb went off, and I thought, I need to bring that bit back. And so now I am excited to announce the creation, the revival, and the introduction of the 3 count. Yes, it's a wrestling name podcast. Wrestling's in the name. We've got to have a little bit of a wrestling theme in on it. And so we're going to do that every episode. It's the 3 count. 3 interesting and possibly disturbing facts about addiction, substance abuse, and recovery. Although I guess recovery facts wouldn't be nearly as disturbing. Maybe. I don't know. We'll see. Anywho, let's go. If you're watching on YouTube, you already see them up on your screen. The 3 count for today. Actually, before we get into that, I do have to say this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal medical advice. We are not responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from the use of this podcast. This podcast is not intended to replace professional, medical, or legal advice. The views expressed in this podcast may not be those of the host or management. If you or someone you know is experiencing suicidal thoughts or a crisis, please reach out immediately to the Suicide Prevention Hotline at 800-273-8255. You can also text HOME, HOME, to the crisis text line at 741741. These services are free and confidential. You can always find that information in each and every episode description on YouTube and where you are streaming the audio version. Now, if you're watching on YouTube, there it is. If you are watching on YouTube, you can see the 3 count. And here are our 3 count for today. Alcohol is the most commonly abused substance. That is 1. 2, 178,000 alcohol related deaths. And 3, 13, the number 13. Let's go back to number 1. Alcohol is the most commonly abused substance. And honestly, let's admit, probably not surprised by this. Without Alcohol Awareness Month being here in the month of April in the United States, many of these facts are coming from the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. They have done a fantastic job of not only studying the effects of alcohol and alcoholism as it pertains to the United States of America, but society in general as all And so that is why it's not surprising to really see alcohol as the most commonly abused substance, because look at how readily available it is. You can now actually have alcohol delivered to your door. And if you can't yet, chances are it's on its way. With the popular driving delivery apps now at our fingertips, it has never been easier to have alcohol sent to the doorstep and sent to a person. Um, and I'm not going to be that podcaster that sits here and says, especially when it comes to alcohol, you shouldn't drink. Don't ever drink. For me in my journey, I have found that one, I actually have a physical allergy to alcohol, in addition to a mental allergy as well. I cannot drink. I have not been able to drink successfully. Doesn't mean that others can't, but for me, I cannot. So, do want to make that clear up front. And I think it's important to understand the dangers of these substances that we are ingesting in our body. Because when you look at alcohol in general, you see it everywhere on billboards, in magazines, TV, on the radio. And how is alcohol portrayed? It's portrayed as sexy, social, um, part of a lifestyle. You really look at um, alcohol commercials in general, and what do you see? You see these beautiful, attractive, fit, handsome, socially accepted people all laughing, playing, enjoying each other's time. And for many of us, it's actually quite opposite, the effect that alcohol has on our lives. So I believe it's not surprising whenever it is presented in that manner that alcohol is the most commonly abused substance. Number two on the three count, 178,000 related alcohol deaths. That's right. 178,000 alcohol related deaths, thus making it the most preventable cause of death in the United States. That is more than smoking. That absolutely blew me away because I figured smoking might be number one, but in fact, it is alcohol. So imagine being told, hey, the more you drink of this substance, the more likely you are increasing your likelihood of death. And typically, I think it's fair to say a lot of us would think, okay, well, we're just going to stop. Um, you would think that would be enough to curb the amount of drinking, but that's just not the way that things work, especially those that are in active addiction, which we will discuss later on in the series. So we're not going to get to it today, but be on the lookout for that one because that one's going to be a fun topic to dissect and talk about. And the last one here is 13. No, we're not talking about Taylor Swift. My team's I'm a Kansas City Chiefs fan, and no, not related at all to that. 13th, though, is the median age when people start to experiment with alcohol. However, studies of social media trends on platforms such as TikTok are starting to show that younger folks are starting to actually rebuke alcohol. They're starting to see it in a negative light of the fact that there are very few health benefits, if any, of consuming alcohol. I mean, how often have we read, oh, well, if you have a glass of red wine on full moon Thursdays that precede the 13th month on the 12th, all that stuff, like trying to pigeonhole it. But yet, the generation that is upcoming, um, they are starting to view alcohol very differently. And I thought that was very interesting. So that is your three count for this week. And I think that's also a great way to move into our topic for today: why sobriety is not recovery. Okay. You're going to see the way that this podcast tackles topics. I am not going to state something just for the sake of stating it throughout the whole process. I will try my best to be informational in addition to entertaining. That one's debatable. But informational, citing sources, citing history, things like that to have an informed opinion and commentary. So you will see this episode is going to be a great way to get a taste of how I am going to handle certain topics, because I think it's important to come from not just a angle of personal experience, but also with informed decisions and informed information, which I guess is kind of, yeah. Anyways, let's move on here. So, why is sobriety not recovery? Well, first, let's take a look at the definition of recovery. First, as stated by the Oxford Dictionary, which actually has three definitions for recovery. I'm going to list the two that has to do with recovery from addiction. If you're curious about the third one, plug it into your Google machine and you can check it out for yourself. The first one here is the action or process of regaining possession or control of something lost or stolen. Now, there's 2 points that I want to focus here on real quick with this definition. One is regaining possession or control. I really like this definition as it relates to addiction, because when you think about active addiction, whether you are in active addiction or a loved one that has been in active addiction, think about it. They've lost, chances are, if the addiction use has gotten to a point, chances are they've lost their family, they've lost their kids, they've lost their job, maybe they're kicked out of school, they've lost friends, they've lost finances. There's a lot of loss that comes in addiction as it grows. And I want to make this point again, too, because it is fair to state that when we talk about addiction here on the program, we're not talking about solely just drugs and alcohol. We're talking about everything inside of addiction. Anything that is an active addiction is included in that. So let's make that point clear before we move forward. The other part, too, is process, the action or process of regaining possession or control. I think that is very critical to remember when we look at recovery. And I will explain why a little bit later on. We're going to move forward, though. The other definition of recovery is a return to a normal state of health, mind, or strength. Now, I believe this is probably the first thing and probably more common idea of what recovery is. There's a theory in psychology called Occam's razor. It's a principle that states if you have two competing ideas to explain the same phenomenon, you should prefer the simpler one. But in alcohol recovery, drug recovery, substance abuse recovery, recovery from addiction, unfortunately, it is my belief that Occam's razor does not actually fit here, because it is much more complicated than just a return to normal. And also, what exactly is normal? Now, let's move in here. When did recovery become synonymous with substance abuse recovery? Well, we actually have to go all the way back as early as 1750 in the United States and North America, to be more precise. Sobriety circles comprised of various Native American tribes were founded in 1750. Benjamin Rush, one of the founding fathers of the United States and former treasurer, began educating the public about the hazards of alcohol. Think about that. We actually have studies and evidence that show that alcohol had pretty much been a part of societal norms for a very long time, but it isn't until one of the founding fathers of the United States of America, 1770-ish, the 18th century, that people start to that research is starting to be done on the effects of it. He is actually credited as one of the first persons to introduce the idea of alcoholism as a disease. In 1784, Rush published a pamphlet entitled An Inquiry into the Effects of Ardent Spirits on the Human Mind and Body. Now, that does bring up the question that is very controversial: is addiction a choice or a disease? And as you can imagine, we're not going to get to it today. That will have its own type of episode that's going to address both of those, and I will let you come to the conclusion on that. Then in 1875, a gentleman by the name of Edward Levinston was one of the first to carefully study morphine addiction. So now we're looking at the opiate side of things by identifying key elements in opiate addiction, the fixation on the drug that made it the highest priority even when the user's life situation was deteriorating. So we went from 1784 to almost 100 years later, 1875. Then, after the Great War, World War One, and World War II, research in addiction, primarily opiates and morphine, as that was used to treat soldiers, slowly started to increase as we saw addiction to those drugs starting to increase. And then in 1935, okay, so we're right in the midst of World War II here. Alcoholics Anonymous was founded by Bill Wilson, or more commonly referred to as Bill W., and Dr. Bob Smith, or Dr. Bob. They published Alcoholics Anonymous in 1939, and in 1940, the Quarterly Journal of Studies on Alcohol began publication. In 1972, President Richard Nixon established the Special Action Office for Drug Abuse Prevention. So you look at that, that is encompassing close to about 200 years. And you think about even it, whatever way you want to look at the way civilization has progressed, whether it's BC, AD, or whichever way you prefer, it's still amazing that through all of that, we are just merely now getting into the study of addiction and the way it affects us as people. I feel like we're still very early on into breaking the stigma of mental health, let alone being an addict or alcoholic. Because when you think about, I'm 39, or I'll be 39, and we look at the way that our family's generation, so we're talking about our parents, our uncles, aunts, perhaps our great uncles, great aunts, grandparents, the way that uh, the family talked about someone, that they knew that they were not doing well. They knew that they had an addiction. They knew that they were an alcoholic, but you just didn't talk about it. We kept it a secret. And now we're just now getting to the point where it's okay if someone who, like myself, for instance, being in recovery, it's okay to admit that, yeah, I had some problems and I'm working towards it. And whereas before it was like, stuff it, no, we're not going to get to it. So I think that's something that we need to keep in mind, whether we're in active addiction or active recovery ourselves, or know someone who has been going through the fight for so long, or just now entering into the arena. Um, Now, this is a very broad overview. We don't have enough time to really get into the nitty gritty. That's where I encourage you to do some Google research yourself to find out more about recovery. So, we'll, of course, take a look at addiction at a closer level here in the coming weeks. So, with that being said, we have to look at recovery versus sobriety now. Now, what you're going to see as as a theme here in this podcast series is you're going to see me separate the two more commonly interchangeable terms in society. Um, I think you'll be surprised just how different, not just recovery and sobriety, but you're actually going to be, I think, surprised at how intertwined a lot of common terms are with addiction and recovery, and yet how vastly different they are. So, again, pace yourselves because we've got a long way to go. And hopefully, this piques your interest into learning more, whether for yourself or how to help someone that you love in active addiction. So, we talked about recovery in its terms. Now, let's take a look at the definition of sobriety. Defined by Oxford, sobriety is the state of not being affected by alcohol. Basically, not drunk. If someone is sober, they are not affected by alcohol. they are not drunk. They have abstained. I believe that's a synonym that you can use. Hopefully, I said that right. Did I say synonym or synonym? Synonym. Anyways, it is an adjective. So whenever you say, "Oh, well, they're sober," okay, you're describing their state of being. Now compare that. Okay, so we talked about the state of not being affected by alcohol, not drunk, adjective. Compared that to recovery's definition, the one that we're going to use here, the action or process of regaining possession or control of something stolen or lost. Recovery is a noun, person, place, or thing. I love to look at it at recovery versus sobriety in this terms, because this was an absolute light bulb changer for me. I love Brene Brown's work. She is sober. She has talked about her break from addiction, and she is a guilt and shame researcher. If you haven't checked out her stuff, lots of it on YouTube. Cannot recommend her books enough. So, as a shame and guilt researcher, again, I thought shame and guilt went hand in hand, but actually, shame and guilt are two separate things, much like recovery and sobriety. Now, in terms of shame and guilt, guilt is I did something bad. Shame is internalizing it. I am bad. Sober, I did not drink. Okay. Recovery, I am healing. I am healed. Look at how different those are. Again, I'm going to read this one more time. I know you can rewind it, but I think for the sake of this program and moving forward, once we have it through that lens, it's important to then go back and look through it. Sobriety is the state of not being affected by alcohol. Alcohol is an external substance. Guilt. I did something bad. External. Now looking at it as internal with recovery, the action or process of regaining possession or control of something lost or stolen. Shame, I am bad, internalizing. Recovery, I am healing. The process, internalizing. Whenever you look at it through those, I think it's important because we hear about, especially in AA, people come in and they say, "Oh, I've got X amount of days sober or X amount of years sober," and which is an amazing feat. It really is. But for many of us in active addiction, simply just not using is not enough. I think we need to talk about here's what I did to recover. Okay. And it's not to say that simply not drinking is ineffective, because it is. It Whenever you're in active addiction, sometimes the hardest thing you can do is just not drink. I'll never forget, I had an intervention, and I remember someone telling me, "Well, I just don't drink. Why can't you just not drink?" Well, one, because I'm wired different. You're talking about something internal. And yes, I think that's also too why you see so many people who are trying to get sober relapse. You see the view of sobriety as recovery, when in actuality, sobriety is but just a tiny piece of a larger recovery puzzle. There has been studies shown that full-on recovery requires not just a 12-step program like Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Gambling Anonymous, whatever Anonymous. Not only do you need the 12-step, but you also need the complementary piece of therapy, because while 12 steps helps with the physical recovery um, of abstaining from use, the mental side of things, the mind, that needs recovered in its own special way. It's not as simple as just don't drink. In one sense, it is, but in the bigger picture, it is not. I hope that makes a lot of sense. But I think it is critical moving forward that we look at sobriety as simply just abstaining from whatever a person is abusing. Recovery is the process, at which we get to the deep-rooted cause that we are abusing a substance or action or whatever. Because I'm trying to think, like, how would you define abusing attention? How would you define abusing finances? Kind of going down there. But it is at which the root cause that is exposed that we have not healed from. I'm reading a fantastic book right now that says trauma is not the event itself. Trauma is the wound inside. And I think this is the goal of this podcast, is to separate a lot of terms that are either misconfigured, misconstrued, or intertwined, that they're close enough, but yet they are way far away. So sobriety date, sobriety date, fantastic. But what is the program of recovery? And I think that's where it's important. It is possible. Yes, just don't drink. I don't drink. You don't drink. We all don't drink. But what do we have deep down inside that we are really hurting from? That is what the hard part is in recovery. That's what makes it difficult, because you have to go deep down inside to the parts that you've had hidden, that you've compartmentalized, buried deep in order to survive. And you have to relive those experiences in order to heal from it. And that's why it's critical. Whether it's a life coach, whether it's through therapy, with a friend, a 12-step program, whatever it takes. But it's not just enough. It's more times than I want to be very careful of that, because it is enough. But sometimes it is simply not enough. Sometimes it is simply not enough to just stop drinking, just stop drugging, just stop using. Sometimes more times than not, we need that second component. All right, let's get into listener questions. We are approaching the 30-minute mark. Wow, that was 30 minutes already. Next week, by the way, we are going to look at addiction. So we're going to dig deeper into that. Jess from Arizona submitting a question via social media. Do I have to go to rehab to start recovery? That's a great question. No, you do not. Recovery can actually begin at any point. I think that's where sobriety and recovery run concurrent. And then, they run parallel, and then chances are you'll see one break off versus the other. So you do not have to go to rehab to start recovery. You can technically start recovery right now if you choose. That's the beautiful thing. You are in charge of your recovery journey. You are in charge of your recovery program. Steve from Oklahoma submitting this on social media as well, Wrestling with Recovery Pod. If I am a day counter and have a slip, does my recovery date reset? No. My belief is no. Your recovery date is your recovery date. The day at which you say, I am starting the process of healing, versus the day at which I stop drinking, two different dates. So that's why I say I've been in recovery for over a year, but my sobriety date is vastly different. So send your questions in. If you have them at any time, you can always hit us up on socials, Wrestling with Recovery Pod. We are hitting towards the 30-minute mark. And what are you? This is how we're always going to finish this program. So what are you? Because we are looking internally. What are you listening? What are you singing? What are you watching? What do you recommend I should check out? I am going to recommend for you, if you haven't already, to check out the song by Benson Boone. It's called Something Beautiful. It is an absolutely beautiful song. What I like about it is that it is so relatable, especially in the lyrics where he says, "And I thank God every day for the girl he sent my way, but I know the things he gives, he can take away." And I think anyone in recovery knows that, whether it's however you define it, the greater being, the higher power, the God, group of drunks, whatever you call it, I think it is so important to know that, yes, things are going well, things are going good, and can always end. So that's why it's important to be present. These are so many different topics that we're going to talk about, but we are running out of time. Thank you so much for tuning in. And if there's something that I should be watching, something I should be listening, something I should be reading, drop it in the comments below. Check us out on social, Wrestling with Recovery Pod. I will be back next week. Until then, my name is Zol, and this is Wrestling with Recovery.